although I am a lawyer, I often find myself encouraging everyone in the audience to have a very, very, very tuned and healthy disrespect for the law, only because I think that's very useful. So I'm going to begin a little bit with the most, from smallest to largest concentric circles. So I'm going to start with my own really personal background about the work that we do in Guam, and then move out slightly to the wider Micronesian region, where Guam is a part of the larger Micronesian region in the Western Pacific, and then have a little bit of commentary about solidarity, impatience, and magic. So to start with Guam, Guam is one of 16 remaining UN-recognized colonies. The UN doesn't call us colonies, it prefers the term non-self-governing territories. So we heard other panelists today talking about how French Polynesia was just reinscribed on the list of non-self-governing territories. This is a list that the international community keeps because it recognizes that certain places, mostly small island nations in the Pacific and Atlantic, are controlled mostly by the UK and the US, and these are territories whose inhabitants are colonized, are basically residents of islands that are colonies proper. So we remain on the list and we go back to the United Nations every single year. We're basically trapped because we don't really know how much value it is going to the UN every year to speak for 4 minutes and try to cram sort of 500 years of uninterrupted colonization in a 4-minute presentation. And that's sort of another thing at the UN. The time limits have gone down for people from colonies. So it's very, very sort of torturous to see colonies like Guam and Gibraltar. All of these colonies have only, it used to be 7 minutes, now we have 4. So it just shows you a little bit about how that system works. But we remain a colony, and we have a vivid, long-standing self-determination movement in Guam that's alive and well. But I don't want to talk too much about self-determination in that context. I want to talk about the indigeneity context and actually explain why I was super confused before coming to this panel, this conference, about what panel I would be put on, either the militarism one or the indigeneity one, because both, truthfully, are inextricably tied when it comes to certain islands in the Pacific, because the indigenous rights movement in certain places are almost entirely about the throwing off of militarization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Although we know that there are so many important facets to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this panel is entitled Free, Prior, and Informed Consent. This is so basically what the Declaration so beautifully and masterfully does, it launches the international community in a new direction, sort of a direction based on a new set of values. And the values are most crystallized in this free, prior, and informed consent provision that are peppered throughout the instrument. But Article 30, I want to just draw attention real quickly, if I could read it to you. Military activity shall not take place in the lands or territories of indigenous peoples unless justified by a, quote, relevant public interest, or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by the indigenous peoples concerned. I want to explain why that language is so problematic to me, because I am from a region where a single word can make a world of difference. The word strategic gives everybody in Micronesia a rash. We rush for Benadryl collectively because we understand what the insertion of the one word means. With the dawn of the United Nations in 1945, the world community and the nascent body did not know how to sort of deal with the colonies, so it came up with a bifurcate treatment. On the one hand, you have certain aspects of the UN Charter, certain chapters governing non-self-governing territories, and these were colonies of the victorious Western powers. So we were at first not entitled explicitly to independence, but only, quote, self-government, an ambiguous, purposely ambiguous term. Whereas the trust territories were colonies of the defeated Axis powers, and it was alone these territories that were allowed to evolve toward outright independence. But of the 11 trust territories established right after World War II, there was only one quote, strategic trust territory, and that is the strategic trust territory of the Pacific Islands, which comprises of entities now known as the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Republic of Palau, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. So in this grouping, I mean, the practical importance of the insertion of a single word, strategic, meant that the UN General Assembly, where at least in theory the lambs get to lay down with the lions, it was removed from GA overview, and it got kicked into, it was the only trust territory to be subjected to the oversight of the UN Security Council, just because of the insertion of the single word strategic. So when I see the declaration and I read so many awesome, very to the provisions about free and prior informed consent, it's chilling that the free, prior, and informed consent provision did not, in the end, attach to the general prohibition on military activities precisely because the people in small Pacific Islands are being heavily militarized. So now I want to explain very quickly, give you a photograph of the kind of hyper-militarization. I would say it's a cataclysmic round of militarization that the people of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands are sort of readying themselves for. In Guam, in 2006, the U.S. agreed with the government of Japan to transfer some 8,000 U.S. Marines from Okinawa to Guam. So there's a transfer of 8,000 Marines in the beginning initially, but that number actually grew to 59,000. Not all Marines, but 59,000 U.S. military-related population that the U.S. intended, at least in its draft environmental impact statement released in November 2009, the intent was to move 59,000 people, military-related population, to the island of Guam. Guam is a 30-mile-long island, and it's at its widest point, it's 8 miles wide. And in this island, the entire population is 180,000. So we are talking about a volatile demographic injection in a 4 to 6 year window of time of a population that eclipses the indigenous population. So obviously that has many sort of portentous consequences for our still unexercised right of decolonization and self-determination. So that's just one aspect. There was also plans to birth the island's only deep draft water harbor for the accommodation of the passage of nuclear aircraft carriers. So what this meant, practically speaking, was that they were going to destroy some 70 acres of healthy coral reef, rip coral reef out of the ocean floor to bring in nuclear aircraft carriers. And it's interesting, as a writer, I guess you latch on so naturally to the use of language because you see how often it's a very mischievous enterprise by the U.S. Department of Defense. So their idea in their document for mitigation for ripping 70 acres of coral reef out of the ocean floor was to plant some trees. I think Arundhati Roy said it best when she said, "What do you do with these levels of lunacy? What do you do when the doctors are the ones so dangerously deranged?" So, I mean, for me, that kind of answer, it's sort of really illustrative of how the U.S. still views conceptually, politically, economically, militarily, how it conceptualizes this entire region. Now I'm going to talk about the other aspect is they were going to, for the Marine base and for extra land that they needed for 20,000 foreign laborers, they were going to also destroy 2,000 acres of jungle. We are talking about pristine limestone forests. They were also going to construct a massive firing range complex on an indigenous burial ground with burials roughly 3,500 years old. These, obviously, I won't give you too many details. I think that's enough. I'm just trying to take a verbal photograph for you so you can see sort of the enormity of the proposed buildup. Of course, it's sort of shape-shifting now. It's not 8,000 Marines, it's 4,500 Marines, but next month it could be 20,000 Marines because it's constantly changing. And that's sort of another facet of the indigenous rights movement / decolonization / demilitarization movement on Guam. You have to, you know how they say you have to think on your feet? That is spectacularly true in Guam. You have to constantly figure out the precise your precise strategy of intervention. So on Guam, outside, I'll speak a little bit about the legal side just because that is my primary occupation right now. We filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Defense under the National Environmental Policy Act, and we won. In effect, we were able to stall the proposed firing range we were able to install the proposed firing range over the ancient Pauget village I was describing to you. But I also want to use this case study to show you just how limited the law is. The National Environmental Policy Act, and I erroneously used to call it the National Environmental Protection Act. You see the slip, right? Because I forgot what the P stood for. But clearly this statute has almost nothing to do with the protection of the environment. In fact, even if we won the lawsuit, we really didn't win much, other than a tactical stall, because the U.S.'s legal option is then to go back and submit yet another supplemental environmental impact statement, which, by the way, no one can read. I mean, when they first announced the buildup, they came up with an 11,000-page document that the people of Guam were supposed to read in 45 days. I mean, it was like wading through the water of these 11,000 pages was so unreal. I mean, I can tell you because there were very few lawyers and we were on board trying to come up with this, and it was really hard to, let alone read. I mean, it was hard to read, let alone disseminate a sort of distilled versions for the community. I want to talk a little bit about when I'm running through this now because I realize I probably have like 3 or 4 minutes tops. When I said the importance of the word strategic, there was something I want to describe for you on the ground what happened when the word strategic got inserted before the words trust territory. Not only did it kick purview to the UN Security Council instead of the General Assembly, what it meant on the ground was the nuclear testing program. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 67 atomic weapons on the people of the Marshall Islands, all of those weapons falling on Bikini and Eniwetok atolls. I'm licensed in the Marshall Islands right now, and I'm trying to one of the, I guess, the most immediate tasks is to try to find a way to diversify our international legal innovations, our legal interventions and lawsuits. For example, although Project 4.1, I have 2 minutes. I know that might mean 1, but I'm going to go for 2, just one extra. With the Marshall Islands, it wasn't just that 67 atomic nuclear weapons were dropped. People were purposefully exposed and left on their islands, and then 3 years after the tests were actually brought back to the islands, even if the Atomic Energy Commission knew that it was irradiated to all hell. They were returned, the people of Rongelap, and they lived there from 1957 to 1985 when Greenpeace on the Rainbow Warrior finally evacuated them. But the US military said then there are only 90,000 people out there, Henry Kissinger famously said, who gives a damn? That's basically the plot has never changed. That's always been the attitude. So the people in the Marshall Islands were basically enrolled in a top secret military program known as Project 4.1, where they were essentially studied and many of them not treated. The US military wanted to study the effect of radiation poison uptake in human beings. So what we're trying to do, at least one of my roles is to try to sort of realize the limitations of international law and realize that genocide, for example, is a very specific intent crime. You actually have to prove they have the specific intent to, commit genocide on you, and it's a very high bar. So we're trying to come up with strategies to either charge, instead of genocide, but charge crimes against humanity and figure out corporate defendants, because the United States is going to hide behind sovereign immunity defenses. So this is just some of the work, but I think it's a good example, as with the NEPA example on Guam, is the limitations of law. I think it's really, really important, and I think people in the Pacific are becoming very clear that the law is the new gun. I mean, it's just what you hold up to people's heads and say, don't move, don't eat that, don't touch that. I mean, the law can be this incredible weapon, but it can actually be launched against people movements like a weapon of mass destruction. That's what the law has too often become, and I guess that's a good way to end it. I think the more important moves, although we should sort of be as fertile legal minds as we can be to try to get redress, realize that it's really limited, and the answer is with people's struggles, and it is with solidarity. The people of the Marshall Islands, for all of the atrocities they suffered in terms of miscarriages, birth defects, birth abnormalities, like babies with 2 heads and no eyeballs and half of their internal organs on the outside of their bodies, they should stand in solidarity, and we should make global movements like that. In Fallujah, Iraq, I mean, the Democracy Now! Just had a huge program about the use of depleted uranium, leading to all of these birth abnormalities. So I envision, as an example of the solidarity, and I'll 15 seconds. The example of the solidarity, I would say that the Marshallese should get together with the people protesting the war on terror and make this sort of a really specific type of campaign. I foresee that happening. The last intervention, I would say, is that we, even us, we are suffering from so much trauma in the Micronesian region, Palau, the Marshall Islands, FSM, and you see that, I would say you don't have to look far. Just look at the voting patterns of the United Nations. There is no reason why the people of the Micronesian Islands should be opposing Palestinian bid for non-member observer state status within the General Assembly, which good, it just happened. So that's another example of solidarity that we could do. We could basically realize that we have no natural quarrel with Palestine. So that's something that else we can work on. Okay, done. Thank you.